Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, are Ukraine and U.S. relations freezing over?
You go to work, your city's bombed. You come back from work, your city's bombed. You come to your apartment, you don't have electricity, heating, or water.
With negotiators back at the table, how the coldest winter in years is pushing Ukraine to the breaking point. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Hi, before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode. Have you been watching the talks between Russia and Ukraine? And if you're listening from your podcast app, leave us a review. It really does help the show. Thanks.
My name is Oleksiy Sorokin. I'm the deputy chief editor of the Kyiv Independent, and I'm talking today from Kyiv, Ukraine.
Oleksiy, welcome to The Take. I noticed that the lights went off while we were setting up. How often does that happen there?
Every day, 20 times a day, I would say. Right now, the average electricity time for anyone in Kyiv is 4 or 5 hours a day, which is obviously impossible to live a life in this situation.
Wow. Okay. And this is just a general question before we get started. I mean, are you living with the threat that you could just, the building you're in could be bombed at any time?
Yes, and there was a funny story that I couldn't find the documents that prove that the apartment I'm living in is my apartment. And the first thought was that, okay, if I'm bombed tomorrow, and I'm not going to be able to prove that it's my apartment, then I won't get any compensation. So I felt sad about it and decided to actually go and start looking for the documents.
So how do you manage that situation? I mean, you can't live with the constant fear. You have to push it into the back of your head, but is it always there that your every moment could be your last?
I think yes and no, because obviously when a major attack happens, you feel the fear and you also understand that you may never wake up again. But because it's happening constantly, then it kind of becomes just the mundane, the everyday life. So you go to work, your city's bombed. You come back from work, your city's bombed. You come to your apartment, you don't have electricity, heating, or water. You're like, okay, then probably I'm not taking a shower today. So there's a lot of things that you unfortunately have to get used to, yes.
So before we get into the politics and the fighting, I want to ask you about the weather. Ukraine has now endured 5 consecutive winters of war, and this one is arguably the coldest. Now, I know you're in Kyiv, and I know Ukrainians are accustomed to freezing temps, but can you describe what it feels like this year? What's different, the toll the weather is taking now?
Well, first of all, it's probably the coldest winter on my memory, maybe in the past, 10 to 15 years.
With temperatures well below freezing, the cold has been yet another challenge for the war-torn country. From frozen trenches to overcrowded emergency medical centers, Ukrainian soldiers are fighting to hold territory and keep warm.
And obviously, Russians are using the weather to inflict tremendous suffering on the population. They have increased the number of missile and drone attacks. They have successfully cut Ukrainians from heating, from water supply, from electricity.
The Ukrainian president has denounced what he called a deliberate Russian air attack against his country's energy infrastructure after an overnight assault plunged thousands of households into darkness amid icy winter temperatures.
And obviously, the cold weather and the increase in Russian attacks is having a tremendous toll on the civilian population. There are people who are living in actually unlivable conditions. There's apartments that the temperature inside is similar to the temperature outside, which is actually right now minus 15 degrees Celsius.
Oh man. And you just feel that cold in your bones?
Yeah, we recently had a discussion among our staff, and everybody was just waiting to have a proper warm shower, and all the guys and girls were wearing hats, and everybody knew that it's not only because it's cold, but it's because the last time you were able to wash your hair was, I don't know, 2-3 days ago, right? Because you, I don't know, don't have water, or you don't have hot water, or it's just miserable when you leave the shower because it's freezing cold inside, and obviously you can get sick.
So you never want to get into or out of a shower in Kyiv.
I know. It just, yeah. It's weird. It's really weird how, in the middle of a full-scale war, you basically wind down to like just wanting the basic necessities, right? Something that before the war was absolutely regular, right? Having 2 showers a day, having water to brush your teeth. And now you're like, okay, this actually is a luxury. Unfortunately, we know that until the weather doesn't improve, nothing's going to change. So the situation is pretty bad here.
Yeah, okay. So let me ask you about that. Russia is weaponizing this cold snap, launching hundreds of drones and missiles to attack energy infrastructure in Kyiv and also in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. I think you said previous winters were a lot more mild than this one, but with this year's sub-zero temperatures, the cold can act as a weapon of mass destruction. How scary is the situation there? Are people literally going to freeze to death?
Well, I think it's currently underreported of how many people actually froze to death, because it's obviously happening. There's obviously people in Kyiv, in the capital of a European country, that were unable to live through this winter, not because of health issues, but because they were forced into these conditions by the Russians.
At home, I slept fully dressed. So you understand, several sweaters, a jacket. I slept in a hat, covered myself with a robe on top. As soon as you stick your hands out, everything freezes. So even in my sleep, I dreamed that the power had come back. But sadly, that was just a dream.
And personally, I think it's a war crime, because there's no military or strategic advantage that Russia can get from bombing a power plant in Kyiv. It just makes living in this country miserable, and also it leads to a lot of people, and especially retirees or those people with disabilities, to freeze in their apartments or to have extensive health issues because of the conditions that the Russians are putting the Ukrainian population into.
We'll have more with Oleksiy after a break. So as we speak, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. are gathering in Abu Dhabi for peace talks. These ongoing attacks on infrastructure are actually one of the 2 main parts of this peace framework. They're calling it an energy ceasefire, actually. I guess it's a humanitarian pause to help keep the power on to stop people from freezing. Russia's most recent attacks happened just days after President Trump announced that Russia would cease the attacks on Kyiv because of these winter conditions. I mean, he said it to the world.
I personally asked President Putin not to fire into Kyiv and the various towns for a week, and he agreed to do that. And I have to tell you, it was very nice.
How big of a driver is this issue for Kyiv at the moment? I mean, it seems like for the time being, at least, they have very little leverage here.
Well, it's a major issue for Ukrainians, obviously, but it seems that Russians and the Americans don't really care, right? We heard President Trump saying that Putin has kept his promise and didn't attack Ukraine for a week, which is a lie. I don't know how he counts a week, but Ukraine was hit with a major missile and drone attack on the 24th.
Russia has pummeled Ukraine's 2 largest cities in overnight strikes as negotiators hold talks on ending the war. At least 1 person has been killed in the capital, Kyiv, and several are injured. The northeastern city of Kharkiv was also hit.
On the 27th, there was a major attack on Odessa. There was a major attack on Kyiv again, and in between there were attacks on civilian infrastructure in different cities. However you count this, there was never a week where Russia did not attack, right? So either the President of the United States doesn't have the full information, or he doesn't care about the full information, and both of those scenarios make Ukrainians feel that it's impossible to actually agree to something when the mediator is basically siding with the enemy.
Well, the other main focus of the Abu Dhabi talks is what to do about the territorial gains that Russia has made. Russian President Vladimir Putin is pushing for a formal recognition or at least a de facto acceptance, I guess, of its control over parts of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. How is Kyiv approaching these demands in this moment?
Well, they are red lines for Ukrainians. Obviously, Ukraine will never agree to acknowledge that the occupied territories are Russian forever. So the two sides, I would say, they're really, really, really far apart.
Yeah.
Russia doesn't feel any pressure to stop the war. Russia feels that it's winning the war. Russia is still advancing, even if really slowly, right? And Ukrainians will never agree to give up their land because obviously Ukraine lost a lot. A lot of people were killed, injured. The country was ravaged by war. So there's no demand from the Ukrainian population of actually ending this war in a defeat. And since the US is not pressuring Russia at all, I would say in Ukraine, nobody believes that anything will come out of this new round of talks.
So for Ukraine, the main sticking point to peace has been this debate over territory. But the other part is just how can you trust that the moment that you lay down your arms, that Russia won't just reinvade and take more territory? In a previous era, the U.S. would be that guarantor, but times have changed. So where does Ukraine turn at the moment? Is Europe capable of being that security guarantor?
Europe isn't capable of being that security guarantor.
Full stop? Just not capable, you think?
Yeah, I think no. Like, we spoke with European officials recently, and they are really pro-Ukrainian. They're really pro-democracy, pro-rule of law and everything. But they themselves don't believe that Europe is a superpower and that Europe has the power to actually enforce its opinion or its view, right? And so obviously the US would be stepping in here, but with the current administration, I would say that nobody reasonably believes that the US will follow through with anything they sign, right? For example, there were the so-called minerals deal that the US won from Ukraine.
After months of negotiations, the US and Ukraine have now signed an agreement granting America access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals.
And it's forgotten. Well, obviously there's some kind of negotiations happening, but the Americans just decided that they're not interested in this anymore, right?
Really? So this is let me ask you about that, because I remember at the time, the calculus was, well, you give up these minerals, it means that American companies will come in, they'll be in the eastern part of Ukraine with their excavators taking out these rare earth, and there's no way that the Russians would attack because it might kill some Americans. Has that just disappeared, or is that just still in the works?
It's moving really, really, really slowly. And the Ukrainian side sees that there's other priorities for the states, right? And so that's what happens when the US pressures Ukraine renegotiates, then something is signed, then Putin calls Trump, and it's forgotten. And also, it's really hard to deal with a state that every 4 years, the foreign policy changes 180 degrees, right? So you can sign something with the Democratic administration, then the Republicans come in and they don't care, and vice versa, right? We can't say that if even Ukraine gives Trump everything he wants, that the next administration will uphold it, or that Trump will uphold it. So obviously right now, Ukraine is in a situation where it has to continue the peace talks to not see the Americans get angry. But also it can't agree to anything the US and Russia proposes, because it will practically mean the end of Ukraine as an independent state. And so the only kind of path here is to just continue these negotiations indefinitely and hope that something happens. And when we say something, we have no idea what we're waiting for.
Let's talk about how this trickles down to the battlefield. At the moment, the battle lines are pretty much frozen. And I want you to fill us in on where the actual war stands at the moment, but also how this sense of abandonment by the U.S. and the freezing conditions in the city, how this affects the men and the women doing the fighting now 4 years in.
Well, obviously, it affects both their morale, but also their conditions in the front, because it's minus 20, not only in Kyiv, it's minus 15, 20 in Donbass and all over the front lines, which is unbearable temperatures to be outside and defending your homeland. I guess the slight good part about this is that it's also freezing for the Russians who are attacking. So that's why there's less attacks during the freezing conditions. That's why the front line is not moving, I would say, almost at all. The new push from the Russians is expected when the temperature rises. So probably somewhere early or mid-March. Obviously, Russia has the manpower to continue attacking indefinitely. They're losing around 25 to 35,000 people each month.
Wait, say that again.
25 to 35,000 soldiers per month.
The Russians.
The Russians.
Good Lord.
Yeah, and Ukraine's goal is to have, and that's what the Ukrainian defense minister said, we want to kill 50,000 Russians per month to make sure that it's too costly for them to continue this war. But Russians, unfortunately, have the manpower capacity to just continue attacking and to continue advancing. And so this is something that's going to continue this year. Obviously, they will be able to get more land, and this will then make Putin and his allies in the White House feel that Russia is winning the war and that Ukraine needs to agree to an even harsher deal.
Oh man, I there is this sense that Russia is just walking away with this thing. It's on the march. It's an unstoppable force. But 25 to 35,000 people a month. The amount of Americans who died in Vietnam is like 57,000. That's like 2 months of fighting. So the idea that Russia is not paying a price is totally false.
No, it is. The problem is that they don't care, right? Like, Russia is a country of 146 million people, live below the poverty line, especially those who live far away from Moscow and St. Petersburg. So basically, for a lot of the people joining the army, getting a massive payout, it's something that they actually consider and they accept. And I know Russia is hiding the numbers. Russia is doing everything possible for the general population to not know how many people died in this war. But still, the people know that people are dying, right? It's impossible to ban grief. It's impossible to keep all the people quiet. So
when you're
Russians
losing 300,000 people a year, you can't cover that up.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just recap. Total victory seems impossible for Ukraine. Total defeat would mean Russian domination. They're throwing 35,000 casualties at you each month. And then peace without security guarantees is unacceptable. The US is out of the equation and Europe seems incapable. So what do we do now, right? So we started with the Ukrainian people. Maybe we end with them too. Right now, it's the dead of winter. It's cold and it's dark, but this is Ukraine, right? Everybody knows that spring will come eventually. It might take a while, but it's coming. Considering the options on the table, are the people ready to endure this no matter how long it takes? I mean, do they have any other choice?
There was a recent poll, and it was 2 or 3 months ago, when the question was basically, would you agree to a peace settlement that would provide Russia with the territories that it occupies? And 73% of Ukrainians said no. It was obviously before the cold, but I would not, speaking to people in Kyiv, speaking to people in the fields, to soldiers, I don't see a strong support for signing anything that entails a Ukrainian defeat, right? So if these harshest months of winter didn't have an effect on Ukraine's morale to keep fighting, then I have no idea what will.
Wow.
I think the problem here is that everybody's talking about just ending this war, but just ending the war is not a solution. Providing Russia with a victory is not a solution to what's happening, right? We see that Russia is waging maybe a cold war on Europe, on the States, and I think the US and Europe have to come to terms at some point that Russia's defeat is the only viable solution, right? Not for the sake of Ukraine, but for their own sake. And this is something that I'm actually really mad at, because nobody will come to the rescue if Russia attacks, for example, Estonia. No one. The US troops are not going to defend Tallinn. But for Tallinn to be safe, there shouldn't be aggressive totalitarian Russia that has the means to attack. And so I hope at some point Western officials will finally get this, but unfortunately it may come too late for Ukraine.
Oleksiy, I can't tell you how much I learned during this conversation. I feel like I have a much better sense of where the war is and just how bleak the situation is, unfortunately. But thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you for having me, and it was a really interesting conversation.